Welcome back. I'm Melissa Harris-Perry. Yesterday, during our Race Talk segment, I tackled the story of Rachel Dolezal, the president of the Spokane chapter of the NAACP, who was outed this week for misrepresenting her race. Now, I was fascinated by her personal story, but honestly, I'm more interested in the reactions to Dolezal that seem to deeply invest us in policing and protecting racial boundaries. So I invited Allison Hobbs, author of Chosen Exile, A History of Racial Passing in American Life, to join me in puzzling through the question of what is at stake when we defend racial identity as contested territory. And I've been thinking through all of this week, and I wanted to be deliberate in considering the possibility that the answer to this simple question posed to Dolezal, are you black, may be more complicated than just yes or no. So, on yesterday's show, after stipulating that, if in fact race is a social construct without biological basis, I said this. Is it possible that she might actually be black? And the best way that I know how to describe this, and I want to be very careful here, because I don't want to say that it is equivalent to the transgender experience, but there is a useful language in trans and cis, which is just to say some of us are born cisgendered, some of us are born transgendered, but I wonder, can it be that one would be cis black and trans black? That there is actually a different category of blackness that is about the achievement of blackness despite one's parentage. Is that possible? Now, while Allison and I were exploring the question here on the show, those of you out in Nerdland had already come up with your own answer. And responses on Twitter came fast and furious with a nearly unanimous opinion that not only was the question inherently problematic, but that the answer was a resounding, oh, hell no. Now, I want to pause here to say that I use the word trans and cis not to make a direct comparison to transgender identity, but as a way to try to find language to express the idea of a complex racial identity. But I also want to recognize that being trans is not an idea. It's a lived and historical experience of a group of people who are, right now, vulnerable to violence and to discrimination and inequity. But Nerdland, I heard you loud and clear, and today we're going to go even deeper. So if, as Mahatma Gandhi once said, honest disagreement is often a good sign of progress, today I want to advance this conversation even further by bringing back a guest from last week who has been outspoken in her disagreement with me. Cherno Biko was among the many trans activists who came for me in social media during my early days of figuring out how to be a better trans ally. And on last week's show, she got my whole table together over what we were missing about trans identity and intersectionality. So here with me again today is Cherno Biko, creative director of the hashtag Mrs. Biko World Tour and We Happy Trans, and CFO of the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. Also, Purvi Shah, the Bertha Justice Institute director at the Center for Constitutional Rights. Also, Hannah Simpson, a trans activist and medical student, and Jamel Bowie, who is staff writer for Slate. Thank you all for being here. Get me together, Cherno.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Of course.
Only a white person could get this much attention for being black.
For being black.
The difference really between what we see with Rachel and what we see with trans folks is that Rachel had to start pretending and trans folks have to stop pretending, right? We see so often that trans folks come into themselves, and Janet Mock always talks about passing as what? Passing as myself. I'm not pretending to be anything. And so I came with 3 tips for allies because I wanted to frame this in a way that was not focusing so much on Rachel, because we see so often, even with the marches in Ferguson, and folks getting involved in the Black Lives Matter movement and white folks needing to take a step back. So number 1, allies, please listen up. The tip is to listen. What we saw last week when I was on with you and we talked about me getting you together, you said, great, that's good. That's what we need more of. When people are telling Rachel Dolezal the issues that they're having with her, she's saying, you just don't understand. That's not listening. Tip number 2, speak up, not over, right? There are so many people who could do the job that Rachel is doing at the NAACP, and she's not allowing folks to she's not empowering people to speak up for themselves in terms of black folks. And number 3 is don't give up. This is tricky. and we all make mistakes, but the goal that we need to reach together is more important than just this moment in time. So,
all of those to me are profoundly useful. And it is important to me to be able to pause in a moment where I feel like what was happening in part was that I was in a lot of headspace. But I also don't want to lose the thing that I really am committed to trying to think about whether or not race needs to be quite as fixed as I feel like is getting policed in this moment. And so what became clear to me is that using the language of trans and cis as though it was just language not connected to human experiences is itself a kind of violence to do. On the other hand, I want some kind of language to talk about what if she's not pretending, and not Rachel in particular. I want to be careful that it's not about this woman in particular. But what if, in fact, because I do think there's a similar language that has been used against transgender people, that they are pretending to be their authentic self-expression. And so I'm just trying to figure out, is it possible to be born into a body that is not an authentic expression of your racial identity, and what words that might look like? Hannah, Jamel, Horvey, I'm the only person on this one.
I'm not disagreeing. That was my head shake of not entirely sure how to approach the issue of language, because I just think there's so much happening in this particular story. I actually am very open to the idea that people who don't have African ancestry or Black parentage or grandparentage can feel a deep cultural affinity with Black culture. I don't think that's a crazy thing, and I think that, and there are examples in American history of exactly this, of people sort of integrating themselves into the Black community and effectively becoming Black. Where I sort of begin to pause, though, is I think that the actual fact of living in a racial hierarchy is that your racial identity, and not like your Black cultural identity, but your racial identity is imposed. So I could not walk into a room and say, I am actually a white man.
Okay, but, and so Hannah, this is part of what, and yet so too aren't our gender identities imposed in a similar way? Like, isn't there also a thing that has to happen, not in one's lived experience internally, but how the world sees, like, so that idea of I can't walk into a room and say I'm a white man, it's also true that until there are some physical manifestations of identity, for example, for Caitlyn Jenner, that Bruce Jenner could not walk into a room and say these things without also being ridiculed and, having that sense of expression.
Well, Melissa, I think it's okay to borrow some of the language as long as we're not confounding the experiences. And there's lots of parallels you can make with anything. For example, there's a certain analog in the idea of taking hormones, that I take estrogen to help feminize myself, and a cisgender male athlete could take testosterone and use that for athletic performance enhancement. Now, we wouldn't call that being transhuman. We call that doping.
Right.
So, yes, there's a parallel, but you can borrow language. It doesn't mean it's the same thing. I think what really scares me about this is this hashtag wrong skin, that people are trying to imply that there's a wrong way to be in this society or in any society. And I'm not downplaying the idea that different people have different experiences and that they are both imposed upon and upbringing. I think there's two analogies. One going off from Caitlyn Jenner is the idea that she didn't have to add testosterone. She had a beautiful story that was compelling enough on her own as an Olympian. It didn't need anything else, and I think Rachel Dojel's story is compelling on its own and is interesting. It didn't need falsification. But furthermore, this hashtag of wrong skin, it's the people who keep saying that enough, making jokes about it. And as a trans person, I can take a few, but as a Jewish woman, I also look at this and I say to myself, well, if you keep saying wrong skin, Caitlyn Jenner's not the right Olympian, it's Jesse Owens to look at. What would he think about wrong skin when he went to the Berlin Games in 1936 and won 4 gold medals against the Third Reich? That's my question. If you keep saying wrong skin, what's next? Hashtag master race?
Well, I do think that Rachel does have the wrong skin and that blackface is never good, right? It seems like we go through this every year, but around Halloween time, we have to keep reminding folks that we're a culture and not a costume, and that they can't continue to keep donning on. Blackface is rooted in histories of not only deception and oppression, but also propaganda in this sense. It seems like everybody wants to be black until the police show up.
Oh, so stop. I want you to stay exactly there because we're going to take a break, but that is exactly the thing that I want us to dig into next. Hannah Simpson, thank you for being here. The rest of the panel is sticking around, and after the break, the cost of losing one's racial identity and exactly this point about when you can take it off and put it back on.